Gregg, thank you so much for coming here to the Parallax podcast.
Love it. Very happy to be here, Tom. Always enjoy talking with you.
Yes. So to start us off, you just recently published an article on Psychology Today about some aspect of the UTOK frameworks and theory, which was about Mind 2, if I remember correctly, which is
that is correct.
Experimental realm that encompasses like 4 different realms of experience, which be the experience of the outer world, you call it sensory awareness, then the experience of inner feelings, the experience of inner pictures and images, and the internal voices, let's say. So, and before we go into these 4 different realms of experience, there's also Mind 1 and Mind 3. And could you shortly relate to these 2 things and give us an overview?
That's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. So, I come into this world, asking this question, what is psychology? So that I'm a psychologist, it dawns on me that our frame of reference on what is psychology is very convoluted. And that's in stark contrast to the natural sciences like biology. We can debate what life is, but biologists don't worry. They're the science of life. And chemistry and physics and geology, they're pretty clear on what their sciences are. Even anthropology is fairly clear on what it is. Psychology actually is different. It doesn't know what it is in terms of, is it science of behavior, science of mind and behavior? What do we mean by behavior? What do we mean by mind? And we struggle enormously with the basic definitional system. So one of the things that UTOK is really born out of and seeks to do is to get very clear about what we mean by psychology. And quite frankly, what that means is actually we need to get clear on what we mean by science, what we mean by behavior, and what we mean by mind. Okay. And this gets us into this whole issue of that the concept of mind, the way it's used, is used in very different ways by different people. Okay. And what I analyze is that there's mind as the behaviorists mean it, which is basically functional awareness and activity that animals engage in that you can observe from the outside. Okay. And this is a portion of Mind 1. Actually, it's Mind 1B, which refers to the behavior that you can see that takes place between the animal and the environment. And then you have the cognitive neuroscientists, which say that actually mind is this neuro-information processing or neuro-cognitive processing. It's the information instantiated within and processed by the nervous system that allows for the behavior of an animal to engage. And really, it's the brain-mind system. Notice I didn't say anything there about consciousness. I talked about computational control or cognition, or information processing. Well, in my system, that's Mind 1A, the neuro-cognitive informational processing architecture. That doesn't say anything necessarily about consciousness, although it's going to relate. And then you have this other meaning, which is mostly our everyday meaning. Hey, what's going through your mind? You are very connected to your mind. Your mind's super important. What is this thing called the mind? And this is this felt sense of subjective conscious experience of being in the world. Our first person embodied perspectival experience is one meaning. Okay, that's like how do you feel pain and how do you see? And that's Mind 2. That's the hardest thing to share with somebody directly, or it's the hardest thing to see in somebody else. It is the thing that grounds you from your perspective. It's just the subjective perspective of being in the world. And it's also related to the hard problem of consciousness, at least in philosophy. So the hard problem is, well, if you take in sort of a naturalistic view, how does that Mind 1A turn into Mind 2? The mechanics of that, we have correlations for that, but we don't understand the mechanics. But that's not the only aspect of our mind. There's this whole other mind that is mediated through language, and I really think is structurally, functionally organized around to justification, and that's Mind 3. And that's quite different than Mind 2, because look what we're doing. My Mind 3 goes right through my skin in the form of verbal behavior. It's propositional information, and goes right into your, as long as you speak the language and have a basic schematic, then you get to understand and we can share directly. So Mind 3 is this justifying process, which I also think takes place on what I call the culture person plane of existence. What makes us persons are this justifying, talking, rational reasoning. We are also primates, who are mammals, animals, and primate animals have clearly higher mammals have mind too, and we can debate where does mind two come from. And then we're all part of the animal kingdom, which is the sensory motor loop that allows us to get up and move around. That's mind 1A, and the inside of that, mind 1B. So that gives us a taxonomy. And the reason I lay that out is because I think there's huge, there's a lot of lame and confusing terminology around mind and consciousness. And some people like Rene Descartes in the Enlightenment, when he talked about mind and consciousness, it was really mind three. That's really what he was interested in. Certainly, and when the philosophers talk about mind, generally it's actually this human mind, understanding, self-conscious reasoning domain. Yet cognitive neuroscientists and now 4E cognition and all this other stuff is much more about the embodied mind. And sometimes they're referring to mind two aspects of embodied mind from first person. Sometimes the behaviorists, and they're taken. And of course, if you're scientists, you have to kind of come from the outside. You're talking about the functional awareness and responsivity that you can see from the outside. And I see a lot of confusion in the literature and debates about the literature because people have different reference. This mind 1, 2, 3, I think helps us get a better vocabulary. So offer
fantastic.
Do you have any questions about that? Or
no, I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
And hey guys, just a quick announcement. If you're interested in learning more about UTOK, Parallax is offering an exclusive online course with Professor Gregg Henriques and Marcia Gralha this March. You'll find the link in the description. UTOK, the Unified Theory of Knowledge, is a new system for understanding ourselves and the world around us. What is your worldview? What is your understanding of human consciousness? What leads to neurotic suffering? And how can we reliably be wiser and more adaptive in our everyday living? With this Parallax course, you will learn how to speak UTOK and see yourself and the world in a new way. And now back to the interview, I guess. And questions that are, on my mind for quite some time now that I wrestle with personally. And I think, that model and this framework might help to, organize and help me with this. And so, so let's jump in. Into mind 2, right? And start with sensory awareness.
Right.
And so, I mean, obviously that is something, the description of it's something that everybody can relate to. On the other side, if you read, let's say, constructivists' literature, it's not just, and I don't know if you mean that, but it's not just something that we passively experience the world, right? There are underlying processes or there are theories that say, coming from Piaget, I think, that there's way more constructive processing at work than we consciously experience. So like we learn concepts like hard and soft and round and everything and colors. And so there's a constructive processual aspect to making the world as we experience it. So, and if I just can, it's like when we are small and we're confronted with a car engine with a motor, it's just a chunk of metal, and then we learn and we know this is a metal because we distinguish it from other materials. But then we learn, and then we make it a complex machinery out of tubes and everything. So we differentiate the word active by constructing something.
That's exactly right. And that's embedded in. So, right. So let's talk a little bit then about that. Okay. So let's go into what is this mind 2? Okay. It's really, I consider it an epistemic portal. Epistemic here means a knowing, a process by which it's going to pull in information and then make sense out of that information. Okay. When John and I did our work on this, we identified it as at least having a minimum of 3 different features, which we can relate to your phenomenology by qualia. So qualia is the experience of being in the world. And there are 3 different aspects of mind 2. And this will get to your question about this issue of that actually it's a construction. It's a virtual reality construction is one way to think about it, at least in our minor terms. But let me give you the elements of it that we can relate to so we can see. First is Well, first there's the experiences of itself, like the taste of wine, okay, or the smell of a rose, or the hardness of something. This is what John and I call adjectival qualia, which means that we have contact with the properties of something. So we're presented with something, it's about something, and we experience its properties, its redness, its coldness. Okay.
Especially if it's new. Especially if it's new, it's something that we don't have a framework for that, right?
Right. Well, that to the extent that we don't have a framework, it will draw our attention and surprise, and then we'll try to construct, oh, that's the category that fits into. And to use Piaget, if we're already familiar with it, it generally gets dropped into the background. That's assimilative. Okay, that's assimilation. If it's new, then we're going to have to accommodate and build new schematic structures to understand it. That's what we're doing much when learning, is we're building this network through assimilation and accommodation. We're building this network. And what's actually happening is we're bringing what's called a top-down schematic, which is basically, hey, this is our sense-making structure. And then we're going to apply it to the bottom-up input that we have. And it is a constant. John Vervaeke will talk about recursive relevance realization. Okay, that recursive means there's iterative feedback loops going bottom up all the time and top down all the time. Okay, I don't know if folks here have ever seen the duck. Well, it's pretty common, so many people probably have the duck rabbit illusion. Okay, I don't know if you've ever seen that, but basically there's a picture of a duck and a rabbit. Now pay attention to your mind to experience, and what will happen is, oh, I see it as a duck, and then I see it as a rabbit, and then I see it as a duck, and I see it as a rabbit. What's happening there is that it's the same stimulus, okay? The same black, white things are coming off nothing's changing there. But what's actually changing is your schematic is essentially trying to predict what the pattern is and tell you, oh, we have a match, okay? And when you have a match, you have a conscious experience of the gestalt, okay? But actually the way the design is that they're two equal matches depending on how your attentional shift is organizing it. And so sometimes it's like, oh, there's the match to the rabbit. Notice that's top down. And then you flip over, there's the match to the duck. And inside your consciousness, you're getting flashes of duck, rabbit, duck, rabbit. And you can watch yourself from a meta observer perspective, watch that first order schematic flash back and forth. That's a great example of how much top down processing. I'll give you another example of even somewhat more dramatic that I was just reading about from Andy Clark's more recent book on the experiencing machine. And so his whole model in modern 4D cognitive science is about predictive processing. Okay, so the whole task of the nervous system is to build a model and anticipate what's going to happen. Okay, active inference is a Carl Friston term for this in relation. We're going to actively infer what the reality is and anticipate. And then you actually construct your experience of being based on what makes sense. The example he said is there's a construction worker, okay, jumped off a ledge and landed on a 10-foot nail, went right through his boot, and he was in absolute agony. Not surprising, boot's coming on, okay? Well, then they race him in, get him into the ER, they cut off his boot, and it turns out the nail went right through his toes, the space between his toes, and only scratched him a little bit, okay? And when he saw that, the pain eliminated, the pain that he experienced in his foot went way, way down, okay? So that's sort of a duck rabbit thing. If you showed me a nail coming through my foot, I'd be like, oh my God, just the mere framing of that then sparks off. And then you realize actually a lot of that came from his top-down expectation, okay? He co-constructed the world. So our perceptions of the world are absolutely a matching process of our top-down expectations and schemas where we're trying to assimilate what we see. And then there's new stuff coming in. We accommodate, we experience surprise. We work to build accommodating structures. That's, I'll finish one last thing and then I'll shut up. But the properties are these adjectival. John and I argued, and John in particular argued that there's a here-ness, now-ness, and together that frames that gives the unity of conscious experience. The framing through which we are experiencing our epistemic portal, we call that adverbial consciousness. And then we engage in valence, like, is that a good thing or bad thing? Pleasure and pain are certainly the experience of these. So we have this framing. It gives us this adverbial consciousness that pulls together our input to give us a gestalt. That gestalt allows us to pull out frequencies of properties and experience those properties and then judge them as to good or bad. That's sort of the core essence of our mind to framing. And absolutely, it's a top-down intersecting with a bottom-up process.
Right. So there's another experiment. I don't know if it's called the split brain experiment, where you cover the real arm and you put a fake arm, and is that called
the rubber?
So
Well, it's called the rubber hand experiment.
yeah, right.
The rubber hand experiment. It's a great experiment.
But
It
is that
shows.
something that that they tested with animals too? Do you know that?
That's a good question. I actually don't know. It's certainly
Because
just
that
so
would
people
belong
are.
to mind one, wouldn't it? You know, if
Well,
that
it's
would be
mind
like
one, mind it. Well, you could argue that will emerge in either mind one, mind two, or mind three
right,
aspects of it. Okay,
right,
so just so the folks are clear about what this is what they're showing is the power of top-down expectation to give rise to your anticipatory experience. So what they do with folks is they have a rubber hand, they put it out, they take your hand, and they start the process by they stroke the hand as they stroke your hand. So they'll put my hand underneath the table, they'll put the rubber hand there, and they'll stroke both the rubber hand and my hand at the same time. Just that kind of synchronicity ties me into the visual, so that the visual hand is now the rubber hand, even though cognitively my justificatory system knows it's a rubber hand. My perspectival embodied system now picks this up as being my hand because of the correspondence with the rubbing of my actual hand, and then they start playing around with it. And it's remarkable for folks. I actually haven't done it, but I've seen the experiment many times done. They'll really start to feel like that's your hand. And it often ends with a dramatic event where a guy pulls out a hammer by surprise and crashes it down. And you'll be able to jump out of the thing, hand, because it becomes really an embodied extension. So that's a great example of how powerful the top down, how easily it can be tricked, sort of, if you want to call it tricked or moved in. And then once that becomes the expected experience, then that is what mind two is experiencing for sure.
right. Fantastic. So there is in the sensory awareness, this perceptual experience, there is a constructive aspect in it, that that we are it's not just like in the old models that we're experiencing reality as it is. It's way more interactive. We're somewhat using, again, a constructivism. We're structurally coupled with reality, but it's still not clear how that all works. But there is, at least from the conscious part, or from the psychology part, there is a part where an aspect that we're constructing that, and at least
completely.
Right.
So. You have to I mean, just in basic philosophy, to have a experience of reality, you need an epistemic knowing function on the ontic real. Okay, so that you can't just. This is like Kant is like the thing in and of itself without any knower is a really confusing thing. We can use the models of that, but what would be the thing without any aspectualizing? Your senses are always aspectualizing key aspects of the environment based on your evolutionary history as a primate. Think about how different the world is. I often use the example of a dung beetle. We're running away from shit because it smells nasty. Dung beetles are running toward it. And if they have, I don't know whether dung beetles have mind two. We can talk about that. But certainly at a mind one functional awareness and responsivity, the dung beetle system is designed to pick that stuff up and say, hey, that's food. And we can get a lot of energy out of that. And we're going to organize our behavior accordingly. So whatever it is, that's an approach thing for a dung beetle. And that's shit is a good thing there. For us, it's like, oh, we're going to move away. And that just tells you, wow, yeah, we are built to respond with valence and framing to the world based on our constructions of it, for sure.
Right. Okay, so moving on to the next question that I had, in regard of all of these four doorways to experience, right? And so I was wondering, what is the relationship of these realms to each other, right?
Right.
Because, like, again, there was, I think I mentioned that in another interview, Niklas Luhmann, this German sociologist who created, the social version of systems theory. And I think in '84, he published a paper where I think he was the first one who attributed autopoiesis to consciousness, So that's a very interesting paper. And so what he does he identifies the elements of consciousness and psyche as thoughts and representations. And he says they are in a kind of autopoietic dialectic with each other. That means I can have a thought, right? And then I can think about a thought, but then I'm taking the original thought as an image, right? And so you move from one experiential realm into the next. And then I can take images and weave them into thoughts. And so there's an autopoietic kind of processing going on. And I don't know how you would frame that, or how you would describe, this interrelationship between these four realms.
Great. Yeah, no, I appreciate, right. I'd need a little bit of, if we were to make correspondences, what we mean by image, representation, thought, we probably need to sort some of that out, but I'll just talk from where I'm coming from along this. So first, let's go. You did a great job, but let me just talk a little bit about these four frames. Okay. And they're designed here to be basic and not necessarily comprehensive. Okay. But this is the ground of your framing. I invite us to just pay attention to this as what I call the gross ground of your framing. Gross, I'm using here in sort of the Eastern tradition, like there's gross consciousness, and then there's sophisticated meditators and all of the sort of inner sciences, if you want to call them that, of the yogi tradition and advanced meditators and they open up all sorts of different, subtle elements and etc. And I'm fascinated by those. I think they're cool. I'm starting at a much more basic level here. Okay. And I really want to just help people, like the Western science with its obsession on behavior and measurement and everything else has done a pretty bad job in giving us standard vocabulary for our phenomenological. I mean, you can study phenomenology, you can be Hegel and Husserl and all that, but not here, like in the United States, man, we suck at really helping people understand their underlying subjectivity. So the first thing I want to say about this is pretty basic and should be very available and for utility process. Okay. And so the four, you can look outside and track what is in the exterior environment. And we call this sensory awareness. Okay. And there's a technical term for this. It's called exterioception. Okay. Exterior, in other words, the task, and this is the task of the animal to detect what's in the environment out here. Okay. This becomes important because then this other frame that you can then point your consciousness towards to inner feeling, which I labeled as interiorception. Now, I took some liberties there because there's actually a number of different internalception perceptual systems that you can actually shine your light on. For example, the vestibular system. I don't know if anybody's ever, been dizzy and spun around in maybe a ride or whatever, and then got off the ride and was wandering around. Well, that's an inner sensoryception. That's not necessarily interiorception technically, but in this case, this would be tracking your inner feelings. So you could be like, wow, I can't locate my body in space. You can track where your body is. Technically, that's called proprioception. But we don't need to worry about all the refined elements in this context. It's just you can shine the light on the state of your body. Okay? So you can shine the light on the world and you shine the light on the state of your body. Okay? That's the basic issue. It's pretty basic, and then we can get into the details. Then you can shine the light on the way in which your higher mind, thinking mind, I would actually call it, starts to bring images, which could be like nonverbal thoughts and representations. This gets into whether or not, how you would actually define those, but basically pictures in your mind. Okay.
Right. A pink elephant.
Pink elephant. Okay. That would be an imaginary picture. There are really three big vectors that we do. So pure imaginary. It's like, oh, pink elephant. Okay. You can do anticipatory. Hey, after this, what are you going to do, Tom? And you'll have an imaginal structure about what your future is. And memory. Before this, what did you do? Okay. And so you can now create vectors of complete imaginary. You could create vectors of anticipatory future, create vectors of past. This is your inner seeing world. Okay. What it does generally is it integrates across the different senses and then places you as an acting agent in time. And then it allows you gain access to, what you've done in the past and make predictions. That's inner seeing. Okay. Now, what inner seeing is doing basically is higher mammals and birds and maybe others to various degrees, but this is this capacity to simulate the sensory motor loop. Okay, so the sensory motor loop's engaged in the environment, and we can see this in the first two layers. What do you see out there? What do you want to do? And that's an immediate interactive looping with it. And then higher animals have working memory and this capacity to extend and run simulations. Okay. In fact, we can see this in like a rat in a maze. They can track its brain activity. They can see that it comes up to a maze, and actually they can track its brain knowing whether it's going to simulate running down the right-hand side of the trail or the left based on its brain activity. So they can really infer, oh, it's basically imagining itself going left, imagining itself going right. That's inner seeing, at least corresponds to human inner seeing capacities. And then finally, we get this narrator on top of that, and that rats generally don't have that, and I don't think really any other animal has it. We talk about that. And then this capacity to self-recursively understand, justify, and narrate what is actually going, comprehend really reflectively.
Right.
So this is a stack of different elements. These are the core elements that allow us to regulate ourselves. It is the exterior referenced against the interior. That's really what the sensory motor loop is doing. Then simulating, that's what our access to inner seeing is. And then for humans, narrating on top of that.
Right. So I'm really stuck with this autopoiesis on consciousness thing, I must admit.
Okay.
So
okay.
and because I mean we already the question I had before was how much of the sensory awareness is constructed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we get a feedback from the world, it's already a simulation, it's already in construction. Mm-hmm. And so what we're doing, and I mean you use the metaphor of shining a light, which is perfectly fine, but it's like, okay, there's a loop there, an internal loop of shining the light to the more exterior, to the more interior, and that all plays along in a game of mental tai chi or something. You know, so it's not really, there's not really an input and an output, right? And so there's an you can't have one of these experiential realms without the other one. They're kind of belong together, because it's like only the sensory awareness doesn't make sense if you have if you don't have inner feelings or inner representations of, so they're kind of playing.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually the gestalt, the organized gestalt of your consciousness, okay, is framed, at least in UTOK, by what's called the PME formulation. Okay, P stands for perception. That's the input. Okay, and then it's automatically referenced against your M stands for motivation. That's the felt sense of where you want to be. E stands for energized motion, which basically is tracking the valence of the relationship between your perception and your motive. Okay. So I think when you're really hungry, you open your eyes and you see a steak. If you're a big steak eater and you love steak, the way you see that steak is related to your interior perception. So that's after the meal, you bring another steak out, you'll experience it radically differently, right?
Right.
Okay. So fundamentally, you're embedded in perceiving the world and tracking it in an autopoietic way relative to what your homeostatic and allostatic processes are inside. And those things are intimately intertwined. And then they energize you, emotion, relative to that connection. And your experience then is a fused element. We can see what's the perceptual elements relative to the motivational and emotional, but the felt experience of being in the world is a conglomerate of those, a unified conglomerate, and they're completely iteratively related in an autopoietic way.
Right. Fantastic. So, you know, that leads into the third question that I have, that of language, you know, and I wonder what you think about this, because I mean, in do all this framing in this modeling of how we interact with ourselves and the world, the aspect of language is, well, quite important, I would say, because within language enables us to certain perceptions and limits us in other perceptions. And I think, like, for me at least, a great example is always, and I love Wilber, don't get me wrong, I'm going to publish his work, Religion of Tomorrow soon in Germany. But, you know, he talks about lines and stages and levels and states. And I always think, well, obviously, there are no lines, there are no stages or levels. There's no drawer that you can open and that's, oh no, that's a stage, right? Or that's, you know, and so because this kind of nominalization of processes kind of creates an illusion that there are, you know, things and not processes. I mean, we know this, there's no sunset. There's just, you know, the rotating earth. There's no waterfall. There's like streams of water, you know, pulling down by the gravity. So you get my point.
Of course.
And so,
yeah, absolutely.
And so, so I'm thinking about language, and I'm thinking about, okay, you have the, you know, the academic sciences, and you mentioned them, and they have like a, let's say, rationalistic formal operational approach to their subject, right?
Yep.
And let's call that modern use of language.
Okay.
And then
Sounds good.
came in all the postmodernists with their deconstruction, and you equally have completely new ideas of how to use language. You have in the philosophy there Guattari and Deleuze, like wild language experiments. And, but it is, and it's interesting because they're kind of deconstructing the kind of ways to use language. And then we get into the more postmodern or meta-modern or integral kind of way. And I think, okay, so how do we approach an integrative model of the psyche, as Wilber does, or how you do? And with which kind of language should we do it? Because again, it enables certain perspectives, but it limits also certain perspectives, right? So because again, if you say it's a representation, that's, well, you can do this obviously, but underneath there's a process going on, right? And so how do you reflect on that? How do you deal with the language problem itself?
Well, that's a great question, and it's at the heart of UTOK. In fact, the birth of the idea that's ultimately going to become UTOK, it happens in 1996, where I get a new grip on the evolution of language, human, and when I say language, I mean human, propositional, symbolic, syntactical, semantic language. Okay, that's important. Other animals have various elements of, they certainly communicate, they're parts of language, but there is a particular network of parts that come together to create a novel information processing and communication system, propositional language. Okay, and so for me, the idea was this. It's called the justification systems theory, with a specific hypothesis inside of that. And that is that we start with this emerging capacity, which is going to be, loosely framed as what Chomsky identifies as the language acquisition device. But I think he reifies it a little more than is probably warranted. But that doesn't matter. The bottom line is that humans seem to have this capacity for symbolically tagging various elements and quickly being able to sync up their actions by symbolically tagging. I was just reading a book called The Language Game on how we do charades, and how quickly people will, especially they play for any length of time, develop symbols, really quick gesture symbols, and then as gesture symbols evolve, then it's very easy for humans to sync their minds up, see what the attention is on a particular entity, and then pair it. Other animals are much more limited in this capacity. Well, that's the symbolic tagging element. Then you get a syntax where you put the symbols together and you get the capacity to generate propositions. So propositional language then gives you a novel open form for informational representation and communication. All right. And so when I was saying adverbial, hey, I can take the concept of adverbs and apply it here. This is great. It's a great opportunity for abstraction. By the way, this great opportunity for abstraction is going to potentially get us in real trouble, because if we then over abstract and then reify our abstractions, then we lose contact with the world. Somebody like Ian McGilchrist is going to be making his career out of the argument that modern society built propositional abstractions off of a left hemisphere specificity that reifies features and mistakes the reified features for the entire whole. That's a big error. We can get more into the specifics of that. But the point of it here, from a UTOK perspective, here's what goes on. And that is, we get to a point where we go from antelope there to there are the antelope. Antelope there is a set of associations. You can dynamically engage that, see if that's true, but you can't propositionally analyze it as an epistemological claim. That's what a proposition is. It makes a fact or value-based claim that can then has meaning and then can be analyzed. Well, when it has meaning, that meaning I call a positive meaning. The positive meaning then by definition opens up negative meaning potential. By that, it's not true. The antelope aren't over there. Those are gazelle, they're zebra. It also opens up negative value, meaning we're gonna force our attention here and wonder what we should do. Maybe we should be looking at rabbits over there. Why is this important? What it means is that propositions open up the issue of questions. Questions are docking into propositions and opening up negative space potential. Hey, how do you know something? What's going on? It basically says that it invites you to try to fill that in. And then this creates a positive negative space dynamic where we're going to try to fill our propositional knowledge And the argument of UTOK is then we build systems of justification. Okay. Now, oral indigenous people get together, they live in the world, they build systems of justification within the relational context. So they're nested in the actual relational context. They build these systems together and they embody and live them in the world. Okay. As we moved from oral indigenous into traditional, we needed a different kind of representation, much more formal, so that we could regulate civilization and human exchange that is much more instrumental and generalizable. Okay. And then we build these much greater abstract systems of refined knowledge, both at the level of things like governance and religion, money, and all these technologies. And we then live in an increasingly abstract world there. And out of that comes modernist systems of justification. The most relevant in some ways for the kind of knowledge we have is then science. Okay. Science then recognizes, hey, we're embedded in and we make these claims, but these claims may be BS. In fact, I would argue Socrates, the whole Socratic method, opens up the idea of refined reflection on our justification. And then science generates a kind of method to test and remove alternative explanations to get more and more quote unquote objective knowledge. It's also the case that this emerges in a socio-historical context. And the Enlightenment didn't know how to contextualize their scientific justifications in society while also recognizing what truth value they held in general. Okay? Because they didn't know how to do that, they left themselves, vulnerable to a continental philosophical critique, a postmodern critique in essence, that says you guys built these systems of justification, but they really function as narratives in a power-based context. Right. Okay? Now, UTOK, and I think Wilbur also in some ways allows you to zoom out and basically say, well, yes, we can recursively identify these as justification systems that do emerge out of particular elements. And at the same time, by recognizing that dynamic, we can also understand the ways in which that dynamic reveals truth claims, okay, the way scientists, traditional modernists. And so what I would say certainly is UTOK is a meta-modern perspective that enables us to understand some of the kinds of truth claims that science, particularly the natural sciences, and this will actually get into psychology and its confusion, ultimately in the relation of social sciences, so that I would fall in a pretty similar to Roy Bhaskar's critical realism. UTOK gives us a framework to understand science as building these systems of justifications in interpersonal, intersubjective context, which is more a continental angle, and at the same time achieving certain capacities for objectivity that transcend cultural context, which is an old modernist claim.
Right. I mean, I really like the idea or the notion of, did you say labeling or, put to, what word did you use?
Well, there's symbolic tagging.
The tagging, yes. Because, I mean, it's like I just read that recently, that example from complexity theory that, well, we don't know actually what a phone is. We tag it and we make it very simple so we can interact with it. But if we take, the name and the label away, and look at the phenomenon in space-time and what it does to culture and all the things that come together to make it. So we don't know what a phone is, how it changed our cultural trajectory. And so it's like, and I mean, that happens to everybody who takes at least a little bit of LSD, let's say. So all the names go away. And then you are confronted with the infinite complexity of a pencil, and then you ponder it for hours and hours. What is this thing? Till you finally realize, oh no, that's a label, that's the tagging again, and then you can handle it. And so it makes life easier. And so, but you have on one side, the infinite complexity of perception, and then you have the tagging. But I think in a way, we also always have to push a little bit, to concretize our labels. No, and to see is that really a thing, or is it a process, or what is underlying this and all these things?
Totally, and indeed, I get obsessed with this issue of, well, what's this tag called psychology?
Right.
All right, and what should it be? How should we define it? And what is the ontological referent in the world? What's the thing in the world that the concept of psychology should be, and should it be a science, and what does that mean? And why has this been such an unbelievable difficult to build a coherent system of justification about this thing called psychology? That becomes my obsession. And it turns out that this issue of trying to build a vision logic and propositional logic and institutional logic for this thing called psychology was unbelievably difficult. I mean, by the historical documentation, as anybody that looks at the literature is like, this guy said one thing, this guy said another, this guy said another, and no one could actually even get a general grip. The way biologists get a grip on life, no one gets a general grip on what psychology is. And that to me then points to a deep and profound hole in our basic understanding.
Right. And so that's perfect, because that leads perfectly into the fourth question and the fourth topic that's on my mind. And I think we share a passion there, because so from my point of view, it's like, so I call this the cognitive sphere that I'm in, right? And so it's like all these kinds of minds that you're, at least mine too, I can't leave that except I'm dead, right? And so it's like I'm independently of what I'm doing, I'm always in this recursive loop, and of these four realms of experience. That's one issue. So I can't leave my cognitive sphere of experience, and I can't enter yours. I can't witness how a thought emerges in your mind. I can infer it when you do like something with your eyes or something, right? Totally. But I can't be part of your cognitive sphere. That's right. And so, and that we
call that the epistemological gap, by the way, the epistemological gap.
Right. And
in my book, I call that.
Right. And so that is, of course, problematic if we think about psyche or consciousness itself, because, in order to have like a scientific approach, we would have been able, or should be able, to bridge that gap and see what happens, from the outside of, what you're doing, how a thought emerged. Exactly. But I'm always within my own sphere.
Right.
So, and that creates a tension and a paradox, because I mean, everything is prone to my own experiences, my own bias, everything. And there's like this great quote from Robert Anton Wilson from the 70s or 80s: everything that the thinker thinks proves the prover proves, right? Or what John C. Lilly said: in the realm of conscious mind, that what you think is real becomes real. And so there's always this kind of thing that we're bound to our own processing. So if that is true, how and then there's the other aspect which you mentioned, then there are an infinitude of different models about psyche. And how do they all kind of stack up to each other? Because they're all born out of their own processing of the authors. So how do you get a grip on what psyche is? So that's a you get what I mean. So how?
Oh, I know what you mean.
So how, it's like psyche seems infinitely malleable in a kind of way. So you have a model, and then it certainly seems to be true. And of course, if you become more academic in your endeavors, and then you create some techniques to account for that. But within the publisher scene, there's a joke about again an author who again has a theory of mind that he has to propose, and so it's a conundrum.
It is a conundrum, right? I mean, there's 100%, and historically, it's a conundrum, and it's a nightmare of confusion. So let's just, people have been screwing around with this for a long time. UTOK, if we're going to do a course, UTOK proposes some new frameworks that I think help us make, and it's unified at the level of there's a lot more coherence that's available to us than has been in the past. But it is a new UTOK, is a learning system. It's a language system. So it's like, actually you have to learn, it invites or offers new kinds of definitions. So for example, in UTOK, there's a very big difference between psychology, okay, and what psychology is the science of, and psyche, okay? In fact, psyche in UTOK isn't a scientific term, okay? Right. Psyche actually refers to the unique, particular experience of being in the world, in the here and now, for each person as they are experiencing it. Okay. Right. And we're talking, your whole point is, well, isn't this true of all of us? And aren't we all? I would argue that the nature of science, okay, both its epistemology, its language game, does not have access, okay, doesn't have access to this part of existence. It doesn't have access to the unique, particular ideographic experience of being in the world. What do I mean by doesn't have access? It essentially treats that as what I would call error. Okay? So science is about building generalizable and reliable models. Okay? That doesn't mean that you explain everything through science. Okay?
Right.
All the shit that just happens, okay? Like think about doing an experiment, right? Somebody does an experiment and then you realize you screwed up the measurements. Let's say you're a chemist, right? You put this in, you're supposed to follow these rules and get to think, oh, in step 3, I completely screwed this up. The results that I got were completely, and now I understand because I didn't follow the procedures. You don't go write that up as a publication, okay? You call that error because they're a unique set of evidence that happened in a historical fashion that aren't generalizable. So you just discard that, and that doesn't fit into the canon. It's not like you call somebody and say, it's a miracle, some weird, unique, ideographic thing happened. You just say that's irrelevant. Well, each of your experiences can be thought of as being seen to be a unique, ideographic moment in time historically. Like it just happens that I'm in this chair that I happen to buy. I don't need to call some scientist and say, hey, explain this or call it a mystery. So each of our unique particular historical experiences are actually these kind of potentially random events. They give us an enormous amount of meaning, but from a scientific perspective, potentially, they're just, we need to find them. Scientist wants to find what the generalizable realities are. So that's one of the key epistemological differences. I use the term psyche to reference what it is that is our unique particular. And I want to be clear that my psychology isn't about explaining the unique particular reference. It's about explaining the general causal frameworks that give rise to your functional awareness and responsivity. Now, functional awareness and responsivity is really interesting because it's a term that allows me to frame what I see in you from the outside. Okay, I'm watching your functional awareness and responsivity right now, right? Your eyes are doing this, you're behaving, you're tracking. I can manipulate variables. There are salient control variables that you're tracking that are not, and you're responding in particular. Well, that's your minded behavior in the language of UTOK. Mindedness is the properties that give rise to your sensory motor loop and your capacity to respond as an animal in the environment. And we can track that and see that from the outside as readily as we see life and matter. I can track your minded behavior from the outside. My argument is the science of psychology should be defined as the science of minded behavior. Okay?
Right.
And if we actually have minded behavior as a concept, we get a way of fusing the concept of behavior with the concept of the mental in a way that bridges some of the big conundrums of the past and clarifies both what we can observe and what we can't, and then start the process of putting this outside in vector of behavior in science and the inside-out behavior vector of the psyche and the observer in lockstep with each other. And I argue that we haven't really been able to do that. So it's actually psychology and psyche. We need both, and they need to be placed in relationship to one another. UTOK does some of that.
Right. So in the years, maybe decades or centuries to come, so if you should, propose or give an estimate, so where does it all go? I mean, will the psyche always be opaque to us, at least half, and always, poke us from a direction that we never expected? Oh, no, that's another thing that we have to account for. I mean, it's like the development will not stop. It will always add something.
Sure.
And is there an omega point that we will reach, or is it like a tangent that we'll never quite
well, I think that we can go through phases of understanding, but I don't think we ever get to the end. So there should, so we can get cumulative understanding. My dream is that we're at a place. I consider the first scientific enlightenment, the consilience of the now natural sciences, and by that I mean the physical into chemical into biological and then other material sciences, and they get coherently organized more or less. Okay, obviously there are big questions, etc., but psychology can't be fit into that. I think that the work that's actually been going on right now by people like Carl Friston, John Vervaeke, and quite frankly, the system that I built says, oh, this is why we have failed to place this in coherent relation. And this is now the vocabulary and the meta-theoretical structure that allows us to do this and to sync up all of these insights, a Wilbur to a Vervaeke to an Ian McGilchrist, and then have a gestalt that can be taught. And when we put mind and then ultimately culture, society in right relation, we'll have a second enlightenment, essentially, an ability to basically, now the culture has a language game that's up to the task of holding mind in relationship to matter, science in relationship to social and subjective knowledge. And that's a game changer. And it's just the start of a new thing. And we'll still be super ignorant for as long as I'm on the planet, that's for sure. We're going to be completely ignorant. We're now just getting a grip. We're not solving the problem. We're actually getting a grip on how to advance our understanding of the problem. That's the way I would think about it.